screen?
Yep.
All right.
All right, so once again, we're doing what about racism? Don't socialists only care about class? And I'm going to proceed with a summary of the article. The article, again, opens with Black Lives Matter. Go ahead and go to slide 3. And talks about the way in which racial division is merely one of the divisions of the working class used by America's ruling class to prevent the unity of workers, and quotes Marx on the critical role of racialized slavery in the construction of capitalism and the extension of capitalism throughout the entire world. The article goes then into a high-level examination of the hyper-exploited conditions of Black economic existence in the United States between the end of the Civil War and the 2 decades following the Second World War. The article asserts that this hyper-exploitation in itself precluded racial solidarity from the minds of most poor whites, which is a point that we will examine more closely in a moment. The article then returns to Marx, who notes the effect of the division of white and Black workers in America, and asserts that the end of Black hyper-exploitation is a precondition for the liberation of white workers and the general working class. Taylor then examines the question of whether abolishing Black hyper-exploitation by itself would be sufficient to abolish racial inequality, and returns a negative answer. Taylor builds this answer on the failure of prior periods of economic expansion to substantially decrease racial inequality, and notes that Black Americans have historically been locked out of America's economic growth by public and private discrimination. Taylor also notes the ways in which racial inequality is reinforced by public policies that are ostensibly race neutral, such as policing, healthcare, and education. Taylor then turns to the question of winning whites to an anti-racist political platform, which question, again, we will examine more closely later. Taylor then continues with a high-level narration of the anti-racist work of socialist and communist organizers throughout the 20th century. This anti-racist work included anti-lynching campaigns. The article notes that the CPUSA went further than the NAACP to raise the profile of the Scottsboro Boys internationally. Socialists and communists were also involved in the unionization drives among Black workers, and many Black social reformers moved towards socialist and communist points of view over the course of their lives as the economic base of racism, rooted in the structure of the capitalist mode of production, became more clear to them. Taylor notes that working class Black activists formed their own explicitly socialist organizations as the civil rights movement radicalized. Taylor concludes with the line, "Today, the challenge for socialists is no different, being centrally involved in the struggles against racism while also fighting for a world based on human need and not profit." Next slide. I see the article as making several points. First of these is that racism is rooted in the capitalist mode of production as organized in the United States, that the ruling class built America's specific racial system to stifle pressure from below. The hyper-exploitation of Black workers prevents white workers from feeling solidarity with their Black peers. Abolishing the hyper-exploitation of Black workers will not by itself abolish racism, because racism reproduces itself through more than purely economic means. Abolishing the hyper-exploitation of Black workers is a necessary precondition for the liberation of the working class. Socialists have historically striven to abolish the hyper-exploitation of Black workers, and Black social reformers have historically moved towards socialist positions as their movements radicalize, because the roots of anti-Blackness lie within society's economic base. Now, I want to examine each of these claims in turn. Next slide. Is racism rooted in the structure of American capitalism? Beyond the Marx quote, we can see from the history of discriminatory laws in the United States that racism is indeed rooted in the need to organize the hyper-exploitation of labor. In the early colonial period, there were no laws against Black slaves to prevent them from earning their freedom and then integrating fully into colonial society. There are records of former slaves marrying white women, which were fairly uncommon in the colonies early on, and succeeding in amassing considerable wealth in the agricultural economy. Laws became racialized as a result of successful organizing by Black and white workers. Jim Crow was erected on the same basis as these early colonial laws for the same reason. It is imperative for there to be a pool of disenfranchised, hyper-exploited labor for the working class, or for the ruling class, excuse me, to use against any effort by the working class to increase its own power at capital's expense. Insofar as this pool of labor has always been Black, this claim is absolutely borne out by the historical record. Next slide. So did the ruling class specifically build America's racial system to stifle pressure from below? Well, they built the Constitution specifically to do that. So it shouldn't be controversial that other things that they did were built for a similar reason. The early colonies had two sources of cheap labor: convicts from the British Isles and Black slaves imported from Africa. These two types of laborers saw that they had a common enemy, and that enemy reacted to their cooperation by increasing the relative exploitation of the Black slaves and encumbering them with various legal disabilities. This legal structure has at various times been extended to other non-Black racial and ethnic minorities, but the effect has always been to divide workers against themselves. Next slide. This next one is, I think, deserving of a little more discussion in depth. Does the hyper-exploitation of Black workers prevent white workers from feeling solidarity with them? And this is a deceptively complex question. One of the benefits poor whites draw from America's racial hierarchy is the feeling of superiority over their downtrodden Black peers. This has been called the psychological wage of whiteness, and in general, since the end of slavery, the more intense the exploitation and dispossession of white workers, the more the ruling class has leaned on this benefit for poor whites. Thus, the long agricultural recession from the end of Reconstruction through World War I saw the construction of Jim Crow and the explosion of lynchings across the South specifically, but also sporadically in the North. This psychological wage of whiteness, therefore, does not exist in a vacuum, but is a purposeful tool of the ruling class. It is a carrot presented alongside the stick of literal and social violence against those whites who work towards solidarity with their Black peers. And the violence deployed against anti-racist white activists has been absolutely vicious, going all the way back to the earliest days of this country. I would argue that what prevents white workers from feeling solidarity with their Black peers is specific social sanctioning of anti-racism, coupled with the consolation prize of the wage of whiteness, which is in turn a byproduct of the hyper-exploitation of Black labor. Next slide. So will abolishing the hyper-exploitation of Black workers abolish racism? Answering this question requires an examination of the structures that underpin and reproduce racism. These structures are not just economic, though economic structures are a big part of it. In the post-civil rights era, formal legal discrimination has been largely replaced by informal discrimination that reproduces injustice on autopilot. If we instituted economic programs that guaranteed all workers good jobs and a living wage and guaranteed livable incomes to those who could not work for reasons of disability or obligations of care, would the income, wealth, education, and achievement gaps between white and Black Americans disappear? I think the answer is clearly no. Pulling the minimum standard of life up for everyone leaves the informal structures of discrimination in place and will potentially even increase the relative racial inequality as the discriminatory structures continue to prevent Black workers from advancing beyond society's very bottom rung. Next slide. Do we nonetheless need to abolish the hyper-exploitation of Black workers prior to the liberation of the interracial working class? This is probably the most self-evidently affirmative claim made in the article. So long as the hyper-exploitation of Black workers exists, it gives the ruling class a powerful weapon to undermine any efforts to advance the interests of the rest of the working class. The failure of past social reform movements to abolish Black hyper-exploitation directly contributed to the ultimate failure of those movements. From Reconstruction through the New Deal and beyond, all efforts to increase equality among people that ignore the unique situation of Black workers have been and will be doomed to ultimate failure. Marx has been proven right on this point repeatedly. Next slide. So have socialists historically worked towards the end of Black hyperexploitation? Yes, the more successful and serious ones have, which is why opponents of anti-racism have historically linked the causes of anti-capitalism and anti-racism, as seen in the race mixing is communism placard here. Socialists have historically worked towards a much broader anti-racist vision than what has historically been countenanced by liberals. The CPUSA's line from the early 20th century called for the creation of a sovereign Black homeland to be carved out of the Black Belt, stretching across several southern states. This was a vision of Black national liberation conceived as analogous to Irish liberation or Palestinian liberation in our own day, and the failure of the CPUSA to hold to this line as it neared mainstream acceptance heralded its withering away and eventual reduction in the Second Red Scare. Next slide. Have Black social reformers historically moved towards socialism? The article cites Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but could have equally cited W.E.B. Du Bois and many others. There's a phenomenon related by many different people who set out to teach theory to those who have less formal education, where they report that those engaged in the labor process at the locus of hyperexploitation have an intuitive understanding of theoretical elements that are difficult to grasp if you lack that direct experience. There is deep revolutionary potential in the mass of dispossessed and disenfranchised. People genuinely do understand what our society is doing to them, and as Black leaders come to more and more identify with the needs of their racialized class, they more and more have seen the need to abolish our current mode of production. So that ends the examination of the article. I briefly want to discuss how we can apply anti-racist thinking in socialist organizing and contrast that to liberal anti-racism. Before we can think about dealing with racism as socialist organizers, we must recognize that we, our movement, and our organization are heavily shaped by the society we are emerging from. This is something that has to be understood to make any sense of socialist history. Just as the Bolsheviks could not help but be deformed by the paranoia and violence of the Tsarist Empire, and the period of civil war that heralded their ascent to power, so every socialist organization is deformed by the society it seeks to reform and replace, so DSA cannot help but be deformed by America's racism. As we have discussed, America's capitalist mode of production relies on racialized hyper-exploitation. The necessity of justifying that system has created a vast array of racist cultural products and an atmosphere of unavoidable racist propaganda. We are, every one of us, a product of the society we want to change. We can, as individuals, sincerely want to build a society that meets the material needs of our Black peers as readily as it meets the needs of everyone else. But as products of a racist society, we cannot help but internalize at least a portion of its propaganda. I want to be clear, I don't mean that we're somehow mystically incapable of anti-racist action because all American socialists are the fruit of America's poison tree. I mean that effective anti-racism has been deliberately made difficult through the purposeful design of America's ruling class. They have well and truly stacked the deck against us, especially those of us who are white. We have been purposefully and deliberately set up to fail by those who benefit the most from the current system. If you go looking online, you can find a number of minority activists and organizers who felt marginalized, unappreciated, and unsupported within DSA. Some of them are liberals, and I'll come back to them in a moment, but most are principled and genuine socialists who want the same feeling of being part of a larger project of social transformation that I know animates many members of our chapter. This is not a new problem for the socialist left in America. Next slide. Asada Shakur, in the quote on screen, related feeling the same condescension and disregard from her white peers 60 years ago. This challenge is not entirely a racial one. Just as America is racist, it is also sexist, homophobic, transphobic, and ableist, and it will be an ongoing struggle to resist the intrusion of these oppressions into our organizing. We must commit to these struggles because failing to do so will rocket us down the same path of failure as all previous efforts to build American socialism, and we have a world to win. So what about the liberals? Liberals generally see racism as an individual moral failing. A white person has bad feelings about Black people and treats them badly as a result. When they talk about structural racism, they mean structures composed of the ideas and feelings of individual people and their moral failings. Liberals try to address these problems through changing people's thoughts and feelings. Liberals promote implicit bias training, and they encourage white people to sit and feel good about how bad they feel, about how wicked and sinful this society is. They do not acknowledge the centrality of the hyper-exploitation of Black labor to the capitalist mode of production as it is organized in the United States. And when confronted with it, they explain it as a side effect of these individual moral failings. If we were a better people, we would have a better society. If we were not sinners, we wouldn't live in hell. Liberals who accuse socialists of not caring about race are projecting their own disregard for class onto their socialist opponents. America has a racially stratified class system. America has a class stratified racial hierarchy. A socialist understands that both of these things are mutually reinforcing phenomena. To use big words, they are dialectical contradictions, and we recognize that neither can be abolished independently of the other. So that concludes the application section. To summarize, as we've seen, the organization of the capitalist mode of production within the United States has prompted the ruling class to erect barriers to prevent the conscious unity of the working class. The very core of the socialist project is to abolish private property, the wage labor system, and recreate the economy such that it primarily satisfies human needs rather than enriching the owners of capital. The socialist movements have historically been deeply involved in anti-racist social reform, and socialists understand that so long as one segment of the working class remains in a position of hyper-exploitation, the liberation of the working class and the abolition of class society will remain out of reach. It is incumbent on us to continue this work if our movement is to meet with any meaningful success. So with that, we can move to our discussion questions. So I'm curious, what did you guys think was the strongest element of the article?
So with regards to this broader discussion and like the article like touches on, that we have there is this tendency that I see among both liberals and socialists, where in different ways we create a reductionism of racism, and I think that for this particular discussion, this article, that the way that it identifies that even if we get every single racist person to change their moral values about race and racism, if we do nothing to address the material conditions, the resources that people have, the wealth that people have, and the rights that people have, if we don't do anything about that, then people are still going to be experiencing deep inequality along racial lines. But that even if we do address those will not be able to be addressed without also working to create solidarity among the working class along racialized lines, where it's no longer white people versus Black people, white people versus Latino people, or men versus women. We need to unite the working class under that understanding. And to do that, we have to be able to also stamp out the those personal biases, and those things alone will not create the change that we're looking to see. So yeah, that's.
Yeah, I think personally, what stood out to me was, really what Nicholas was saying. And the fact that this is all systemic in nature, and it's not going to be as simple as changing people's minds. It's going to be changing these systems in place that are disenfranchising Black Americans, because we can do whatever we want with our friend circles, but that's not going to change policies, regulations, all of those things that are oppressing, marginalized people on a daily basis. And I think that the article did a really good job of, explaining that it's not just the individual that should be changed. It should be just the whole system, the whole, what we think about certain systems and what's next steps we should take with those. That's all I got.
So how do we see the hyper-exploitation of Black labor manifest in the Peoria area?
Would you be able to get like examples that you thought of?
Yeah, it's a pervasive social phenomenon. It's for myself, I have worked for employers who have reacted badly to Black job applicants, and employers who, bosses who were specifically racist themselves. And you can also, I think, see it in the conditions of the housing stock in the areas of Peoria that are predominantly Black, and the sort of long deterioration of the majority Black areas of Peoria as they suffer from disinvestment of city resources. We can also sort of see it in the job market by, when we go into various businesses, what jobs do Black employees have versus white employees? And then in our own workplaces, what proportion of our coworkers are Black versus the proportion of the Black population of the area. I think that we can also see it in policing and the frequency of traffic stops around Peoria. I wasn't able to find it to include it in this slideshow, but there was a map of showing where the police give out traffic tickets versus the Black and other non-white concentrations of population in Peoria, and it tracks very closely.
Yeah. I think that, some of the ways that I see a lot of the inequality here in Peoria is like, if we were to drive around, like you talked about the housing stock, if we were to drive around with a map of all of the redlining that occurred, we could drive through those neighborhoods and you can see the very clear distinctions between neighborhoods that were redlined because they had a large portion of people who were Black located in them, and the neighborhoods that are predominantly white neighborhoods. As the housing rights change, we've slowly started to see people shift back and forth, but those numbers haven't changed a lot, right? And those numbers haven't changed a lot because for us to really address inequality from the standpoint of like the things that really matter to people, the first one is safety. The second one is having food, shelter, water, and being able to meet your basic needs, healthcare, those kind of things. We see a lot of that denial of those things being prioritized in the segments of the community that have a higher population of people who are Black. And so, if we are going to properly address that, if we are going to change that, we cannot just focus on, well, white workers need to be less racist. White workers need to join in solidarity to improve the wages of not just themselves, but also fellow workers. And I think that another area where we see this sort of thing manifest is that in our healthcare system, there's a very distinct difference in how white patients are treated versus Black patients. So if you go and you are injured from working on your job and you have a back injury, you're going to get treated very differently if you're white versus if you're Black, those kind of things.
I couldn't have said that any better myself.
So then what avenues for anti-racist organizing are available to us in Peoria?
I would say that one of the things that we're working on right now, as time passes by in this very moment, is we've seen how Taft, Peoria Housing Authority residents are being treated under that system. That deliberate choices by politicians and by people in charge of managing the resources of those public housing authorities have resulted in places like Taft homes becoming these really rundown, really just terrible living conditions that people are really truly just they need that to be better. They deserve for that to be better. What concerns me is that whenever a housing authority, whenever a public housing project is considered to be failing, the right wing comes in and says, see, haha, we told you these things don't work. But there is plenty of evidence of, if you properly fund it, if you actually have an interest in seeing this thing succeed, that it will and it can. But the fact is that our politicians take money from realtor associations, they take money from landlords, and the people that live in these public housing projects don't have the monetary resources to be giving them donations to their campaigns. And it's very consistent across the board in a national trends that the money that politicians accept is going to influence the way in which they vote, because if they want to continue to be able to run campaigns with those monetary donations, then they have to vote in ways that satisfies those donors. And so there is something there that I think with how we are currently, we're currently working alongside and providing we're working to provide the resources that are needed by Taft Homes residents. I think that that's really an important thing that we're doing right now. And I hope that something significant comes of it for Taft Homes residents. I hope that something is built off of this, that, that they are treated much better than they have been. And the reason why I bring Taft up is that I believe in the numbers are around over 90% of Peoria Housing Authority residents are Black or other persons of color. And so, and they're deeply impoverished because they're using a public housing authority. And so it's really important for us to stand alongside them and do that work.
Yeah. For me, I think a good avenue is also, taking an intersectional approach to any issue that's, we're working towards bettering, because I think, getting the perspective and the just, I guess, mostly the perspective of marginalized groups who are being impacted by these systems in place in Peoria will help you give a better idea of maybe not so much solutions, but for more plans of action of how we can change and better these conditions for Black folks, because it's definitely prevalent. I think it's just a matter of getting those voices in the same room and being able to use those perspectives to our advantage to make these conditions better.
For me, I agree with Nicholas that housing is a major avenue for anti-racist organizing in Peoria. In the past, I believe Peoria had one of the major realtors as the mayor. So in that sense, they have in the past kind of cut out the middleman on directly assuming municipal power. And then there's also the fact that outside of public housing, a larger proportion of Black residents are renters versus white residents of Peoria. There is also, I feel, tremendous opportunities for organizing around education, not just because of the educational inequalities between the different schools across Peoria, but because educational institutions can worsen the already precarious environment that Black residents are forced to live in. And I'm specifically thinking of Bradley University here. I'm a Bradley graduate, and their plan for the future includes a section on diversity and inclusion for local residents. But as far as I can see, that sort of stops at the point where they would admit more locals, or Manual High School is right down the hill from Bradley. I don't think there's a plan to sort of cooperate across those two institutions on the Bradley side of things. But then also Bradley's expansion, in my experience, there's a lot of resentment of the Peoria residents who have to cut across campus to get to their jobs or to transportation. And so some way of integrating Bradley better into the community of South Peoria, I feel could be an excellent avenue for organizing. And then also environmentally, there's a lot of decaying industry on the south side, and that certainly plays into the air quality and the general sort of environmental quality of the outdoors in that section of Peoria. So then what other questions did this article provoke?
I did want to go back to, one of the things that we are really seeing a lot of is that an increase in food apartheid, where there's no grocery stores, there's no way to get food in like fresh food in places like the South End. That Walgreens was the only pharmacy and it closed. And we need to find ways to meet that need for access to food, and we need to do that in a way that really ensures that the people that live in the South End are able to have that available long term. I think that they're opening another one now, and if that one goes under again in 5 years from now, then they're right back to square one, and we really need to find ways to improve those conditions, but also making it to where, if we want to make socialist politics a priority in our anti-racism work, then we need to find ways that don't rely on corporations that are only there to turn profits for themselves and don't particularly care about the people living there, only about whether or not the people living there can produce profit for them. And so that's mutual aid is not a cure-all, but it's sort of like first aid in the context of trying to save somebody from bleeding out. We need to really create strong mutual aid efforts. I'm really impressed with the Budded Matah urban agriculture projects, and I'd really like to see that grow and become more successful than it already is being at the moment. That's just something that I think addressing the food and really addressing like the material concern there of not having access to food is going to be really important, especially over the next decade.
Yeah, I definitely want to uplift that, especially, being someone who studied nutrition in college. So I think these food insecure areas are definitely things that should be highlighted more, because they show the inequity in all of these areas. They show what a city's priorities are, and that's the unfortunate thing about capitalism, is that if a business doesn't see that it's going to make enough profits due to a low income area, then they're just not going to build something there. And I think that's very unfortunate. because everyone deserves resources. Everyone deserves the basic human needs like food, water, and basic affordable living conditions. And, if things such as this keep going on, it's just going to try to get rid of the lower class as efficiently as they can because they have that right to, apparently. And that does make me wonder what the future of Peoria is going to look like in that regard, because if people start organizing around these kind of things, I think that there's a good potential for growth in Peoria and for bettering folks' conditions in their housing, their overall health and well-being. But that's if we take the priority, I guess, in our hands, because sometimes politicians and local officials don't always take those things under consideration unless people in the community actually say what they're wanting. And yeah, that's all I got.
Other areas of concern, COVID has really revealed the importance of having, a good internet and good internet infrastructure. Currently, the city has COVID funds available that it could be spending on building broadband infrastructure in areas that don't currently have it. Not every area in Peoria has broadband internet, and that is something that a lot of challenges have presented themselves, because you can't work from home if you don't have a good enough internet and you don't have secure funds to keep that internet up and running. And so that has become more and more important as communications technologies are more and more reliant on that broadband infrastructure. And if we're not pushing for them to expand that, I think that it would be a mistake. If we want to tie it to socialist politics, one of the things that needs to happen within that is, if we're the ones funding this, if we're the ones funding the expansion, then why are we not the ones who have ownership over that infrastructure? The other one that I'm really quite excited about, because I am personally affected by this, is that we have a major problem with lead poisoning in Peoria. I currently can't drink my the water that feeds into my house, because I just don't know for certain that there isn't lead in that line. And that is a major problem in areas like the East Bluff and in the South End, where there are a lot of homes that were built with lead lines that or that have had lead paint in them or other things like that. And that is a major issue that needs to be addressed. And Illinois has put forward a new requirement that those are going to have to be removed. Those things are going to have to be removed by the water service provider. And I think it's important that, we help people get that. and make sure that people are benefit from that new law here in Peoria as quickly as possible. The fact that these companies have been given I believe it's a 2 to 5 year grace period just to come up with a plan to start removing these is ridiculous. This should have been happening years ago. And they only have to remove a certain number of them every year. So when that starts to happen, we really need to make sure that the areas that are the worst affected by this are getting that first. But I expect that some of the challenges that are going to come up is that landlords aren't going to care. They're not going to make an effort to get their properties free of lead and have them abated with the lead pipes, despite the fact that it would not cost them anything. So I think that is going to be a challenge that we're going to have to parse out as an organization over the next couple of years as this plan starts going into place. And it would deeply benefit the East Bluffs and the South End community. So.
Yeah, and those are also the sections of Peoria where there's still the most residential asbestos.
Yeah.
I think those are all great points. Absolutely agree. So I think that pretty well takes us through the discussion questions. Is there anything else that we want to talk about now?